I'm Sikander Ailawadhi, one of the hematologists from Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida, and lead the multiple myeloma group over here. We will be talking today about disparities in clinical trial participation, which has been an area of focus for us and also for our research. But in addition to talking about the disparities, we will also be focusing on some possible solutions to try and address these disparities, which are extremely important and urgent to be addressed in healthcare delivery. There are quite a few changing and evolving considerations when it comes to clinical trial enrollment and, frankly, just the clinical trials that we have and run across the country, across the world. So, for example, the landscape of the conduct of clinical trials itself has been changing. There are several different kinds of clinical trial types, I would say, that are possible. For example, they could be NCI run or NCI funded. They could be from cooperative groups at academic centers. There could also be pharmaceutical support or pharma driven. And there have been subsequently also different mandates for representation in clinical trials. So, for example, NIH has its own guidelines, and FDA also now has some guidelines about who should be the patient population represented in different clinical trials. There is also an increasing involvement with patient advocacy groups. And while there is a slow, but there is a sure increase in awareness by patients regarding clinical trials. Also, at the same time, the clinical trial designs have been evolving and changing. So, for example, on the one hand, we have very large international clinical trials going on. So you can imagine that if the same study is being run in the US, in Europe, in Asia, and South America, the representation of patients or the enrollment of different subgroups of patients is going to be quite varied. But at the same time, some large randomized clinical trials are now being also replaced by smaller, smarter clinical trials. So running a study in a very targeted population. And that's the reason why some of the drugs have been able to come to the market approved by FDA, even without very large randomized phase 3 studies. Some drugs have been able to get approval, for example, on single-arm phase 2 trials. So that has helped run the studies in a smarter way in overall a smaller number of patients. But you can imagine if there is a niche population, there is less heterogeneity and hence a lesser diversity. We also have now a better understanding of the molecular underpinnings of cancer, if I may say that. That's why molecularly defined subsets of a disease are being utilized to run some specific clinical trials. So, for example, in multiple myeloma, if I was to talk about this, we frequently now use the term pentarefractory. So you can imagine that we are picking only a certain subgroup of patients who have already been refractory to 5 different agents or classes of drugs. Similarly, we talk about, for example, translocation 11;14, which is another very specific subtype of multiple myeloma. So you can imagine that if a study is targeted only for those patients who have this T11;14 abnormality, well, there is going to be a pre-selected group. And if that abnormality is seen less frequently in, let's say, Asians, well, Asians may get less access to the clinical trials and hence treatment with that drug. Just some examples. But all of this is being done in an effort because we know that patients want and need faster access to promising drugs. So how can we address that? And I already mentioned that some of the clinical trials are now being run on large international basis. So, for example, some regimens have been approved for multiple myeloma in the US based on clinical trials in which there was a very small representation of American population. And that's where there have been large phase 3 clinical trials in myeloma leading to FDA decisions. And as I said, even approvals, largely based on ex-US studies. One of the examples is the regimen wherever melphalan is utilized. We hardly use melphalan in the US. Still, there is a combination of daratumumab monoclonal antibody with bortezomib, melphalan, and prednisone. That is an FDA-approved regimen, but we don't really use that regimen in the US much because we use different classes of drugs. When we specifically talk about clinical trial enrollment and how the patterns of enrollment have been seen in the literature, there are some very interesting studies which have shown that the percentage of enrollment of the general population into clinical trials is actually quite low. Data comparing academic centers, community centers, and then even combined data from all centers where clinical trial participation was reviewed based on a landscape report in 2018, it was noted that the average enrolled population in clinical trials in academic centers is just about 15%, in community centers nearly 6%, so giving it an average of just about 8% of cancer patients get enrolled in clinical trials. Now, this is a pretty dismal number, and you can imagine that if the total number is so low, if we try to tease out and hope that this 8% number is representative of the true US national demographic, it's going to be far from that. Other studies have also looked at whether this demographic composition of clinical trials was different when these studies were supported by NCI, National Cancer Institute, or, for example, pharmaceutical sponsored. And several different studies have looked at these kind of analyses. And a couple of them have shown that typically our racial, ethnic minorities, the term that has been typically utilized, but I would focus on thinking the traditionally underserved groups, for example, Hispanics, African Americans, that they tend to be underrepresented in clinical trials. Now, different studies that have looked at this, one of them looking at all NCI-sponsored trials and another one looking at cooperative group clinical trials, have shown a little bit different data. But the one looking at the National Cancer Institute supported clinical trials, all NCI trials, showed that Hispanics and Blacks were significantly underrepresented as compared to the general population in the country. And by the way, I should also say that elderly patients have also been time and again showed to be underrepresented in clinical trials. But a second analysis that looked only at the SWOG cooperative group clinical trials showed that while in that analysis Hispanics were represented similar to the general population in the country, African Americans and elderly were underrepresented again. Data that has looked at racial composition on trials supporting the US approval of anti-cancer drugs looked at studies between 2011 and 2016. And a lot of these clinical trial data was put together. This was an effort from the FDA, from AACR, to try and do these kind of analyses. And it was noted that in the clinical trials leading to FDA approval of drugs in the US, the overwhelming representation of patients was from whites, much more so than the general population seen in the US. And when we break down these drug approvals outside the US and within US, unfortunately, it was noted that in the US, the disproportionately overrepresentation of white population was even more when compared to outside the US. And part of this could have been because outside the US, some of the studies are done exclusively in Japan or certain Asian countries. So it seems that outside the US, the Asian patient representation is still there to a decently larger number. But I can say that Hispanics and African Americans, whether it's in the US or outside the US, have always been very underrepresented in our clinical trials, leading to FDA approval of drugs. It is important to know that the clinical presentation for cancer can be different by patient race and ethnicity. An analysis that was done and published in 2018 looked at a large population database specifically for multiple myeloma. And what we noted was that African Americans presented differently than other racial ethnic groups, in that African Americans had a much higher incidence of anemia, kidney dysfunction, need for dialysis, or increased calcium level, which can all be related to multiple myeloma. In fact, the one thing that African Americans were noted to have much less frequently was fractures or bone disease related to myeloma, and that's because of probably just a genetically higher bone density. But you can imagine that when we talk about clinical trials, they have very strict inclusion-exclusion criteria. So if a patient has much more likelihood of having anemia from multiple myeloma, and there is a cutoff that is fixed across the board for all racial ethnic subgroups, then that African American patient is much less likely to make that cut because they are going to have a more severe degree of anemia. And we also noted in that same analysis that even after the patient has been diagnosed and started on treatment, within the first year after diagnosis, African Americans were much more likely to have a more significant anemia, kidney dysfunction, need for dialysis, and increased calcium for multiple myeloma. So again, even if the patient had gone on to clinical trial treatment, there was a higher likelihood for an African American patient to have significantly more anemia or kidney dysfunction. So not only is getting onto a clinical trial is a problem, but even after the patients have been diagnosed, the African American patients in this case, for example, may have difficulty staying on a trial because they are more likely to come down with these clinical conditions that could either limit their drug treatment or potentially even get them off that treatment. Another analysis that we published in 2018 looked at all the published clinical trials between 1998 and 2011 and explored the role of race ethnicity in multiple myeloma, looking at all the cooperative group clinical trials. Over this span of about 13, 14 years, there were 9 clinical trials that met the inclusion criteria, looking at more than 3,000 patients, and nearly 3,000 patients were included in the final analysis. And in this analysis, nearly 82% of patients were whites, but there are about 13, 14% African Americans, and then only about 2-3% Hispanics. What was noted was that when we looked at patients put on clinical trials over time, in fact, when we looked at these US cooperative group clinical trials, over the years, it seemed that there was a decreasing African American enrollment in the most recent time period. Now, this was a little bit a bothersome statistic that came out of this analysis, and this study was published in 2018, where when we looked at all these cooperative group clinical trials, looking at in the 80s to early 90s, comparing that with the 90s, and then comparing that with the 2000s, it seems that in the most recent period, the proportion of African American representation in cooperative group clinical trials for multiple myeloma had actually gone down compared to the immediate previous time period. Yet another analysis looking at about 177 clinical trials from clinicaltrials.gov data, ranging from 2000 to 2016, looked at the race and ethnicity reporting of patients. And out of the 177 clinical trials that were taken, these are all multiple myeloma related studies, by the way. Out of the 177 clinical trials that were noted on clinicaltrials.gov over the 17-year period, only 78, so less than half, had reported race and ethnicity. And then an analysis was done looking at what the general population representation of those race ethnicities are and what was reported in the clinical trials. And it was again noted that for non-Hispanic African Americans and Hispanics, the proportional representation in clinical trials as compared to the general demographic in the US was significantly lower. And furthermore, what we found was that when grouping the clinical trials by industry or pharmaceutical company sponsored versus NCI sponsored versus university or academic center or cooperative group sponsored, it seemed that NCI sponsored clinical trials had approximately 10% patients as African Americans. University or cooperative group studies had 8.6%, and industry studies only 5% African Americans. And you can imagine that the bulk of clinical trials that are done are run by pharmaceutical sponsors. And this was, again, a stark kind of metric to see that there seems to be a different focus at that time, depending on who was the sponsor of the study and how that would lead to the representation or enrollment of African Americans. A different study, looking at the same problem from a slightly different angle, looked actually at the FDA new drug applications for multiple myeloma between the year 2003 and 2017. And this particular study, which was published also in 2018, noted that the people of color with myeloma have had a smaller increase in population-level survival as compared to whites, and that the data from clinical trials had shown that mortality is similar for people of color, suggesting that population-level differences could be due to utilization. And if a patient was on the clinical trial, there are no survival differences between African Americans and whites. So it's almost like clinical trials seem to be that great equalizer where the outcomes tend to be very similar once the patient has gone on to these specialized centers or specialized treatments. One large study looking at all different kinds of cancers was published in 2019, focusing on just multiple myeloma specific data. This study looked at all clinical trials done in the US over a span of decades. And what this study showed was that while African Americans make about 20% of the US multiple myeloma cancer population, African American representation in clinical trials leading to drug approvals in the US is just about close to 5%. These kind of studies have brought importance to the fact that we really need to develop strategies to have our clinical trials represent the true demographic of the country. And I will talk about all of these clinical trials bringing out these disparities and kind of sum that up with the most recent study in this space that was published just last year. And what we did in that analysis was we looked at not only the representation of people of color in clinical trials, but we also looked at what was the age of patients enrolled in these clinical trials. I had started by saying that elderly patients tend to be underrepresented in the clinical trials as well. So what we did in this study was we looked at the median age of patients for a particular cancer in the US, median age reported in those clinical trials that lead to FDA-approved drugs, and representation of racial ethnic subgroups. And what we found was that the age discrepancy between clinical trial population and the real world population is much higher in studies that do not report race, because we know that race itself is associated with a younger or older cancer population. So when race is not reported, the clinical trial population is even further less representative of the real world age demographics of cancer patients. So by talking about this and enough of noting all these studies, I think we've laid out quite nicely that there are tons of disparities that exist with clinical trial enrollment and how certain subgroup patients may be extremely underrepresented. Are there any potential strategies that we can develop? Yes, I think there are. So I think it's important to set some concrete targets for trial enrollment based on demographics and disease biology. It is also very important to have some targeted approaches addressing cultural barriers. We should really consider regulatory review or publication incentives if accrual of people of color is better. So, well, what if a study is closely representative of the US demographic, and maybe that data gets reviewed on an expedited way by the FDA? These are kind of some out-of-the-box kind of thoughts, but maybe worth considering. There has to be an incentive of why the right population is enrolled. Registrational trials should specify how accrual of people of color will be optimized. I think that is extremely important to have a underrepresented population enrollment strategy in registrational trials. It is also important to pre-specify that we will be doing subgroup analyses by age and race and gender, etc. And trial designs need to be updated. So we need to address our inclusion criteria Because what if, as I mentioned, certain subgroups are more likely to have lower counts? Well, we need to take that into consideration when we decide our inclusion criteria. And similarly, it is important to focus on certain subtypes of myeloma that are seen more frequently in patients of color. I mentioned translocation 1114, that happens to be much more frequent in African Americans. So we better have our 1114 trials equally representative of the African American population. And then it is also important, as I mentioned, to have these pre-specified strategies. Well, this term of a trial diversity officer has been used, and I think it is important to have such a role and hold that person responsible for coming up with a strategy at least. It is important that when we have study site staff, like our coordinators, data managers, they need to be a bit more culturally sensitive trained. There are studies, for example, showing that an African American patient is more likely to be compliant to a treatment or be receptive of a treatment if they are explained that treatment by an African American physician or nurse. I don't think that's going to be possible to match the patients like that, but at least having a culturally sensitive discussion would be important. We maybe need to provide some grant funding to sites which are rich in these underserved populations, but are typically not under the umbrella of our clinical trial setup. So if a site has more African American patients, but typically does not participate in trials, well, how can we help them overcome the barriers so that they are actually able to open the studies and do them? Similarly, after the drug even gets approved, if African Americans were not enrolled, Hispanics were not enrolled in clinical trials, maybe that post-marketing data needs to be collected. We also should consider doing pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies, and also studies of safety and benefit specifically in peoples of color for a given drug. And then these clinical trials tend to be done within silos of their own studies. It's also important to maybe try to merge the clinical trial data across companies, across drugs, maybe grouping them by mechanisms of action so that we can have a richer cohort of people of color included in those analyses. And as I mentioned, it is probably important to try and figure out how we could incentivize clinical trials in institutions where majority of the people of color go. Thanks a lot for your time.